She spent her whole life putting everyone else first. Her children, her husband, her neighbors, even people she barely knew. Always trying to keep the peace, carrying the weight of the family on her shoulders. But the day she was left out of her own daughter's engagement, something inside her broke. And it wasn't just her heart. It was an entire lifetime of swallowed silence, ignored boundaries, and love twisted into financial abuse disguised as help. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about invisible motherhood that role society forces down women's throats, where being a mother is supposed to mean giving up everything, even yourself. But it's also about autonomy, freedom, and the kind of personal rebirth that terrifies people, because it demands you finally choose yourself even when it hurts. Get ready to follow a journey that begins with a $17,000 credit card bill and ends with something far more valuable: rediscovering self-love, reclaiming respect, and finding the courage to say no for the very first time, when everyone expects you to give in once again. And if you've ever felt used, ignored, or guilty just for thinking of yourself, then this story is for you. So hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because every chapter of this turning point matters. It was supposed to be just another routine check. She grabbed her phone, opened the banking app, and nearly dropped her coffee. Right there on the screen, a charge for almost $2,000 at a luxury dress boutique. At first, she thought it had to be a mistake. But the further she scrolled, the worse it got: expensive dinners, spa treatments, beach house rentals, airline tickets. The total? $17,000. Every single charge made with the additional card she had once given her daughter, out of pure trust and care. Only now, it seemed her kindness had been turned into an open vault. It was like a slap in the face from reality. That same daughter who always claimed she was broke, who cried on the phone begging for help to cover her bills, was living like a celebrity on her mother's dime. And the worst part wasn't even the money. It was the coldness. The certainty that, to her, her mother was nothing more than a resource. An ATM with no fees, no questions, and no complaints. A machine always available, always invisible. For days, she was in shock. She didn't tell anyone. She put the phone aside, avoided opening the app again. She tried to convince herself there had to be some explanation. A banking error. A stolen card. Some kind of cruel system glitch. But the names on the transactions were clear. The delivery address undeniable. The dates matched the trips her daughter had posted online. And to twist the knife even deeper, she later had to listen to her daughter complain about the card limit being suspiciously low. That was when the truth of the financial abuse began to sink in. Because this wasn't just an isolated case. It was the sum of years of small abuses, camouflaged as innocent requests. Those: "Mom, just this month, Mom, I'll pay you back later, Mom, I'm just going through a rough patch." The problem was the rough patch never ended. What once looked like help had slowly morphed into dependency. Not real need, but entitlement. Egoism. The certainty that Mom would always be there covering the bill. She felt stupid. Naive. Used. As if she'd been acting in a play where she was the only one who didn't know her role was just to serve in the background. Anger came next. And with it, an even heavier feeling: guilt. Because deep down, she knew she had allowed this. She had erased her own limits in the name of love. She had confused care with submission. And by not saying no when she should have, she had helped build the very prison she now lived in. The nights that followed were long. She barely slept. Her mind spun in endless circles. She kept asking herself, where did I lose control? When did I stop being a mother and become the full-time provider? Why didn't anyone see how much this was hurting me? And maybe the cruelest question of all, why did she still feel pity for her daughter, even after such a blatant betrayal? More than that, why was she so afraid of standing up for herself? Afraid of being called ungrateful. Afraid of losing her daughter's love. Afraid of finally choosing herself and being judged for it. She thought about confronting her daughter. But she couldn't. Not yet. Something held her back, maybe that invisible chain of unresolved motherhood, that toxic inheritance that whispers mothers endure everything, mothers forgive, mothers never leave. So she stayed quiet. She swallowed the scream. Just like she had always done. Just like she had been taught. But this silence felt different. It tasted like an ending. Like something inside her was about to rupture, even if she didn't know what form it would take. What she didn't realize was that this bill was more than just a bank statement. It was a mirror. A brutal reflection of what their relationship had become. A warning too loud to ignore. The click she needed to finally start seeing herself again. And maybe, for the first time in years, she wasn't just feeling pain anymore, she was starting to feel anger. Not at her daughter. But at herself for everything she had let slide. For everything she had accepted in silence. For the fact that she had forgotten herself for so long. What seemed like an isolated case revealed itself as part of a much bigger pattern. After the credit card bill, she began to watch her daily life with new eyes. And that's when the weight of it all hit her even harder. Her adult children had been living with her for years, yet none of them contributed a dime to the household expenses. Electricity, water, internet, groceries, everything came out of her pocket. And whenever she mentioned dividing responsibilities, they had rehearsed excuses ready. "I'm looking for a job. This month was tough. You know how the economy is." But the designer clothes, the shiny new electronics, and the daily takeout orders told another story. It was as if she alone was responsible for everyone's comfort. No one offered to help with meals, cleaning, or anything at all. If she complained about being tired, they listened with indifference. If she got sick, no one asked if she needed something. She was just part of the background. Invisible like the plumbing, essential like the gas. Always there, never noticed except when something stopped working. The house had become a 5-star hotel, fully serviced, but with no gratitude. Worse than that was the tone of entitlement. As if it were her obligation to keep sustaining everyone. As if she had signed a lifelong contract of servitude disguised as motherhood. One day, her eldest son asked if she could replace the refrigerator because the current one made noise. He had no idea she was still paying off that same refrigerator in installments. And of course, no one cared. As long as the lights stayed on, the food was on the table, and life kept moving, everything was fine. Whenever she tried to set a boundary, the response came cloaked in emotional manipulation. "You're really going to deny help to your own children? And then you complain when we distance ourselves. Oh, but you've always done this for us, now you suddenly want to change?" It was as if she were trapped in a system she had unknowingly built, a cycle where love came with strings attached and only flowed when she gave in. The moment she dared to say no, she was instantly turned into the villain. She began to realize the whole environment was poisoned by a twisted logic. This wasn't a family anymore, it was a structure of emotional and financial dependence. And the worst part was her own fear of breaking it. Because the thought of being alone hurt more than being exploited. That fear of emptiness kept her going day after day, like a machine stuck on autopilot. She carried the weight because she was terrified of the void. But deep inside, she was exhausted. Bone deep exhausted. She started to wonder when exactly things had turned into this. She remembered her children's childhood, the family lunches, the improvised birthday parties, the genuine laughter. Where had all of that gone? When had affection turned into currency? When had hugs turned into invoices? That house was full of people, yet it was hollow. Hollow of love. Hollow of reciprocity. She, who had once dreamed of a peaceful old age surrounded by warmth, now found herself a hostage in her own home. The invisible motherhood she carried had become an emotional prison. By giving everything of herself, she had stopped being seen as a woman, as a person. She was only the mother, the provider, the caretaker, the function. And that hurt more than any debt. Because she didn't want money back, or material payback. She just wanted to be seen. To be respected. To be heard. She wanted someone to ask, "Are you okay?" And to truly listen. But that moment never came. This phase was like lifting a rug and finally seeing all the dirt hidden beneath. The problem wasn't new, it had been there for years, disguised as routine. And she had sustained it all with a tired smile, clinging to the hope that someday things would change. But now she knew they wouldn't. Not because of them. If anything was going to change, it would have to start with her. And that realization began to carve out a quiet space inside her. A space where a fragile desire for change began to grow. Some days, she walked through the house and felt as if nobody could see her. Literally. She would pass through the living room and her children wouldn't even lift their eyes from their phones. She'd say something during lunch and no one would respond. She had become background noise. And that hurt in a way words couldn't capture. Because she was there fully present, fully available but still invisible. And it wasn't just physical invisibility. It was emotional. Existential. As if the world had moved on and forgotten she was still a person too. The breaking point came on her daughter's engagement day. She only found out about the party through Instagram. The pictures were there for everyone to see: flawless decor, luxury catering, laughter, champagne toasts, and not a single invitation for her. Not even a mention. Not even a text that said, "Mom, look how happy I am." Nothing. As if she didn't exist. As if she had been erased from the very story she had helped to build. That wasn't just an absence, it was a stab straight to the heart. A cruel message written in silence: you don't matter. She locked herself in her bedroom that night. She scrolled through the photos in silence. She cried softly so no one would hear. She didn't even have the courage to ask her daughter why she hadn't been invited. She was terrified of the answer. Terrified of hearing that her presence would ruin the mood or that it was better not to mix things. And it was in that muffled sobbing that guilt mixed with something new: abandonment. Exclusion. As if she had been fired from her own family without notice, without appeal. From that day on, everything felt darker. Conversations in the house no longer included her. Her children's plans never asked for her opinion. Even decisions about the very house she paid for: furniture replacements, renovations, dinner parties were made without her. As if her presence was tolerated, but never valued. She had become a footnote in her own home. And the loneliness was even crueler because it was covered with a fake layer of normalcy. Her children still said "love you" on autopilot, sent shallow good morning texts, but in practice they ignored her. That cold, mechanical affection was what hurt the most. Because it tricked the heart. It made it seem like things were fine. But they weren't. This was a toxic family disguised as love. A relationship where she wasn't allowed to exist fully, only to serve. She began to feel that the house no longer belonged to her. The home she had built had turned into neutral territory, ruled by absence and silent tension. When she came back from the grocery store, no one helped unload the bags. When she left the house, no one asked where she was going. When she was sad, no one noticed. She had become a ghost in her own family. Her motherhood had been hijacked by silence, used as a weapon, as a form of punishment. And it was within that silence that she finally began to hear herself. For the first time in a very long time, she realized she missed herself. The woman who used to laugh loudly, who loved long walks, who dreamed of traveling, of afternoons lost in books, of deep conversations. Where had she gone? When had she stopped existing as an individual? These questions echoed inside her. And with them came a painful clarity: she had erased herself in the name of a love that no longer existed. Yet despite all the pain, something inside her began to shift. Slowly, almost invisibly. Like a soft breeze that warns of an incoming storm. It was the seed of an awakening. That moment when, after years of being dimmed, a person starts seeing themselves differently. Not as a victim, but as someone who still has a choice. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to do what no one expected: to live for herself. The phone buzzed again. A text from her daughter: "Mom, can you send me 3,000? It's urgent." But this time, she didn't answer. She stared at the screen for a few seconds, her heart racing. It wasn't just the amount. It wasn't just that it was yet another demand. It was the coldness behind it. No please. No, how are you? Just another hidden order. But something inside her was different now. She took a deep breath, blocked the notification, and set the phone down. For the first time in a very long time, she said no. Not with words but with silence. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. Ignoring that message was harder than sending money she didn't have. It hurt more than making another transfer. Because in that no, she felt fear. Fear of the reaction. Fear of the confrontation. Fear of losing her daughter completely even though the relationship was already hanging by a thread. But along with the fear, she felt something else: autonomy. A spark of strength, as if she had just reclaimed a piece of herself that had been stolen years ago. In the days that followed, she started to see the patterns more clearly. And she realized that the biggest prison was not external, it was internal. It was her fear of rejection. Her fear of being labeled a bad mother. But with that first no, a door had opened. And she began to do the unthinkable: plan her escape. Not from the house, but from her lifelong role as an endless provider. She started researching lawyers. Reading about emotional boundaries. She watched videos. Bought books like Mothers Who Can't Say No and When Saying Yes Means Saying No to Yourself. She was educating herself. Preparing. The hardest part was keeping it secret. Pretending nothing had changed, while inside, she was mapping out her freedom. She began organizing documents. Making lists. Separating accounts. Creating new online banking access. Canceling automatic payments. She stayed up through the night, but now with a purpose: liberation. It felt like walking through an emotional minefield, where every step required caution. But for the first time, fear didn't paralyze her. It fueled her. It pushed her forward. She knew the confrontation would come. She knew her children wouldn't understand right away. That masks would fall. That anger and guilt trips would pour out. But she was ready to pay that price. She no longer wanted to live as a hostage. She wanted to reclaim ownership of her own story. She revisited old memories, dug through photo albums, reread forgotten letters. It was as if she were rescuing the woman she had been before all of this, before the exhaustion, before the guilt, before the years of erasure. And in that rescue, she felt something fragile but real beginning to bloom: the first timid spark of self-love. It started with small changes. She went back to taking evening walks by herself. She called an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. She began cooking just for herself, slowly, with care, with pleasure. She started looking at herself in the mirror with less judgment. What was happening wasn't only financial liberation. It was a liberation from imposed roles, from suffocating expectations. It was the beginning of a personal rebirth, still delicate, but undeniably real. And she realized something: the first step didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be explosive. It just needed to be firm. It just needed to be hers. Slowly, the no's multiplied. No to money requests. No to favors disguised as obligations. No to jokes that belittled her. Each no was an act of affirmation. A reminder that she was still here. That she still had a choice. That yes, it wasn't too late to change. This first act of defiance wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a thin thread of courage unraveling, pulling out everything that had been buried under emotional dust. She didn't yet know where it would lead. She still trembled at the thought of her children's reaction. But one thing was clear: she had started. And when a tired woman begins to choose herself, the world around her is never the same again. Then came the day. Without announcements, without dramatic speeches, she acted. She began by canceling the additional credit cards one by one. Then she went to the bank and closed joint accounts. She created new passwords. She legally secured her assets. She changed the locks on her house. Yes, all of them. This was the new frontier: physical, financial, and emotional. For the first time in decades, she was drawing boundaries not with empty words, but with concrete actions. The feeling was strange. A mix of relief and anxiety. It was like removing a tumor without anesthesia, painful, raw, but at the same time, the air felt lighter. Each decision seemed to clear a part of her soul. She knew her children would react badly, but it was impossible to keep living the way things were. That wasn't love. It was dependency, exploitation, abuse. And to free herself from a toxic family dynamic, she had to break the invisible chains that had bound her for so long. She hired a lawyer, updated her will, put the deed of the house solely in her name, added clauses preventing anyone from accessing her accounts without permission. She started saving small amounts of money in a new account every month. It wasn't much, but it represented more than security. It symbolized freedom. For the first time, her resources were under her own control. And that, in itself, was revolutionary. The most symbolic change was the front door key. She replaced the lock without telling anyone. And the first time her daughter tried to walk in on her own, she couldn't. Furious, she called, "Mom, the door won't open." And she calmly replied, "I didn't tell you, because the rules have changed. From now on, I need to be respected." On the other end, silence. A heavy, offended silence. But she didn't give in. For the first time, she held her ground. And though it hurt, it also made her stronger. The following days brought a flood of passive-aggressive messages. "Are you okay?" Followed by "I just think this is kind of strange," or the classic "after everything I've done for you," as if she owed them something. As if being a mother meant a lifetime debt. But this time, she didn't respond. She was learning the power of not reacting, the strength of silence, the art of not justifying herself. Letting silence do the work words could no longer do. She began setting new house rules. If you live here, you contribute. Give advance notice. No loud noise after 10 p.m. Simple, basic rules, but rules that had never existed before. And the reaction was exactly what she expected: shock, resistance, drama. But she stood firm. She knew discomfort was part of real change. And she knew that no matter how hard it was, she was the one in control now. Her routine shifted too. She changed her schedule to carve out more time alone. She shopped less, buying only what she needed. She stopped asking what everyone wanted for dinner. She cooked what she liked. She watched the movies she enjoyed. She added small touches to the house: a new painting, a plant in the corner, a lamp by her bed. Details that quietly whispered, "This home is mine too. And now, it reflects me." The cutting of access was more than financial, it was symbolic. It was a break with her old self. The version of her that always said yes. The version that erased herself in the name of peace. The version that confused love with sacrifice. Now, she understood that saying enough was also an act of love. But this time, it was love for herself. And that was the greatest revolution of all. The breaking point came on a Sunday. Everyone was home when the youngest daughter, irritated and angry, suddenly exploded, "Who do you think you are now? The owner of the house?" The words struck like lightning. She took a deep breath, looked around, and realized not one of her children defended her. Not one spoke up against the rudeness. And in that moment, the truth hit hard: her place in that family dynamic had been crystal clear all along. But this time, she didn't stay silent. With a firm voice, she answered, "Yes, I am. Because this house is mine. And from now on, everything here must be based on respect." The reaction was immediate. Accusations, shouting, emotional blackmail. "You're throwing us out on the street. Don't complain later when we cut you out of our lives. You're going to die alone, you know that?" Each phrase cut like a knife. But she remained standing. Steady. Not because it didn't hurt her, it hurt, but because now she could finally see the truth. They weren't trying to love her. They were trying to keep her trapped in the same cycle of manipulation they had used for years. But that old woman, the one who gave in out of fear, was gone. In the days that followed, her children began treating her like the enemy. They avoided eye contact, whispered about her loudly as if she weren't even in the room. It was all pressure. All guilt-tripping. And yes, the guilt came. Heavy as always. But something had changed. She recognized it now. She could separate it. She understood that the guilt didn't belong to her. It had been planted there, nurtured for years. It was the price they charged every time she dared to break the rules of a system that only worked if she erased herself. One of her sons tried to flip the script, "You need help or paranoid." It was yet another tactic of disqualification, subtle but cruel. But she was ready. Paranoia? No. Living your whole life serving people who don't even see you, thoughts insanity. And in that moment, for the first time, she saw something new in her children's eyes: fear. Not fear of her, but fear of the woman she was becoming. The woman who no longer bowed her head. The woman who no longer kept quiet. Each confrontation became a mirror. It showed her how far they were willing to go to maintain control. But it also revealed something deeper: how much she had allowed it in the past. Not because she was weak, but because she loved them. A love that had been twisted, exploited, drained. Now, by reclaiming her voice, she finally saw the truth: she was not responsible for the emotional well-being of adults who refused to grow up. Motherhood does not mean being a hostage. Motherhood means support. And support is not the same thing as being a floor for others to walk on. They tried to isolate her emotionally. They stopped including her in conversations, in dinners, in plans. But this time, instead of shrinking into herself, she reacted differently. She started going out more. Inviting neighbors over for coffee. Spending afternoons away. And when she came back, it was as if she carried a different energy into the house. It unsettled her children even more because they could no longer control her attention, her schedule, her spirit. The tired woman now walked tall. The hardest confrontation came with her eldest son. "You're forgetting who supported you when you needed help," he threw at her. And calmly, she answered, "Yes, I remember. And that's why I've always been here. But one act of help is not a prison. And I refuse to stay imprisoned any longer." That sentence ended the argument. And opened space for something new: silence. But this time, it wasn't silence used as a weapon. It was silence as consequence. The rupture was complete. And she would not go back. She knew there would be no applause. No immediate forgiveness. No easy reconciliation. But that wasn't what she wanted. What she longed for now was peace. And if that meant losing the conditional affection of her children, then so be it. Because her life could no longer be lived in exchange for the approval of those who only valued her when she was useful. She had done the hardest thing: she had looked in the mirror and chosen herself. And that choice, now, was non-negotiable. It was on an ordinary afternoon that Elizabeth appeared. She came with a simple cake in her hands and a smile that saw beyond the surface. A neighbor, until then just a passing wave at the gate, suddenly became a point of support. "I heard you're going through a rough time, may I come in?" And just like that, without ceremony, she stepped not only into her house, but into her life. Within minutes, they were sitting, drinking coffee, laughing about trivial things. It was the first time in weeks she laughed without heaviness. And that laughter said it all: there was still room for lightness. Elizabeth never asked invasive questions. She just listened. And when she spoke, it was straight from the heart. "You're not alone, you know." Those words struck deep. Because that's exactly how she had been feeling: alone in the middle of chaos. But with Elizabeth, the air was different. No demands. No judgment. It was friendship in its purest form. A connection with no agenda, no masks. And after so many years of one-sided relationships, it felt rare. Precious. They started meeting often. Morning walks. Impromptu lunches. Swapping books. Talking about everything except pain. And even when pain did come up, it wasn't dramatic. It was lighter. Like sharing a load so it wouldn't crush you alone. Over time, Elizabeth became a counselor, a confidant, almost a therapist. But she never imposed. She simply stayed. Available. Present. and that was more than anyone in her house had offered in years. It was Elizabeth who suggested the first book on emotional healing. Then came others. One of them, The Courage to Be Imperfect, became almost a survival manual. She devoured every page like someone relearning how to breathe. They also began watching movies together, like comedies, silly romances, stories that brought smiles back. It was a quiet form of healing. Small moments of joy that glued back the pieces of a broken heart. And the most curious thing was that with Elizabeth, she didn't need to justify herself. She didn't need to pretend to be strong. She could simply be. Complain. Laugh. Stay quiet. Cry. And everything was met with the same tenderness. There was no emotional game draining her, like with her children. No guilt. For the first time in so long, she felt a genuine relationship based on mutual respect. With nothing demanded in return. Just presence. Just truth. Elizabeth also helped her see that it was possible to start over. You can, you know? It doesn't matter how old you are. Freedom doesn't have an expiration date. Simple phrases, but they landed like seeds. And they began to grow. She started making plans. Online courses. Dreams of travel. Old desires resurfacing. It was as if a part of her had been waking from a coma. And the most beautiful part, this wasn't a lonely rebirth. It was shared. In their conversations, Elizabeth also revealed her own scars. She spoke of an abusive ex-husband, of a daughter who had also drifted away, of her own healing process. Not as competition, but as understanding. It was exchange, not comparison. Care, not rivalry. Together, they created a safe space. An emotional cocoon where two wounded, but determined, women helped each other remember who they were before the pain. That friendship became a turning point. Not because Elizabeth solved her problems, but because she reminded her that she deserved more. More than tolerance. More than survival. More than emotional crumbs. And that reminder changed everything. Because once you taste real affection, you no longer accept anything less disguised as love. And now, she was learning to choose more carefully, even choosing herself. Then David showed up at her door, looking worn down. He had always been polite, gentle, but that day he looked like a broken man. He held a folder of documents in his hands and carried the weight of someone who had been holding a bomb for too long. I need to talk to you, just the two of us. She let him in, surprised. But something in his posture told her this wasn't just a casual visit. And when he began to speak, each word cut the air like a blade. I found out everything. The engagement, it seemed, had been built on lies. Zoe had told him her parents were absent, that her mother was unstable, that she paid for everything herself. David believed her until the pieces began to fall into place. Purchases on her mother's card. Hidden transfers. Stories that didn't add up. And worst of all, the wedding money he thought came from them as a couple had actually come almost entirely from her mother's accounts. She used you as a source, without you even knowing, he said, his eyes wet. She listened in silence. Each revelation confirmed what she had long suspected but had never fully named. It was financial abuse, yes, but also emotional betrayal. The fact that Zoe had hidden the source of the money, used her trust, excluded her from the engagement, and lied to her fiancé proved just how far her daughter was willing to go to stay in control. It was like watching her own life as a film, narrated by someone else. An outsider who could finally see with clarity what she had spent years trying to excuse. Visibly shaken, David made a decision right then. He called off the wedding. He even returned part of the money personally. I don't feel right keeping this. It was taken from you. She tried to refuse. But he insisted. It wasn't just about the money. It was about dignity. An attempt at repair. For the first time, someone looked her in the eye and acknowledged the injustice. Without minimizing it. Without shifting blame. Just simply saying, you were wronged. And I am sorry. That had an unexpected effect. For the first time, she saw someone from her daughter's world walk away, not because of her, but because of her daughter's character. Until then, she had always been painted as the difficult one, the problem, the exaggerator. But now, someone else had seen and spoken the truth. It was an external reflection of everything she had carried inside. And it validated it all: her pain, her anger, her choices. David stayed for over an hour. They talked about everything: how he felt deceived, how she felt used, what they would each do moving forward. "You're not alone," he told her before leaving. And those words echoed inside her with a strength she hadn't felt in years. Because despite the pain, there was also relief. The truth had surfaced. And not by her hand, by someone else's. Someone who owed her nothing. Someone who simply saw. In the days that followed, Zoe didn't show up. But furious messages came instead. "You told him, didn't you? You ruined my life. I'll never forgive you." But she didn't answer. It was no longer her role to save anyone, least of all someone who refused to take responsibility. Zoe had crossed a line. And though it still hurt, she knew it was time to let go. Time to stop carrying the weight of an adult daughter determined to escape the consequences of her own actions. What David brought wasn't only the truth. It was also a turning point. Proof that she wasn't crazy, or bitter, or exaggerating. She was a woman who had been manipulated, erased, exploited. And now, with everything out in the open, she felt she no longer had to prove anything to anyone. Because truth, when revealed, carries enormous power. And with it, she was finally free from the burden of having to explain her pain. All she needed to do now was keep walking. A week later, Zoe appeared at her door. No warning. Her makeup was smudged, her voice trembling. She held a bouquet in her hands and a plea on her lips. "Mom, I made a mistake. Please forgive me." She hesitated. Her heart beat fast, caught between hurt and longing. But something about the scene felt rehearsed. Her daughter's speech carried a tone she knew too well, the tone that only showed up when something was at stake. And now she recognized it clearly. It was another attempt at emotional manipulation. Zoe began to cry, saying David had left her, that everything was falling apart, that "Mom, you're all I have left in the world." It was a predictable script, heavy on drama, empty of true remorse. When she asked, "Do you understand what you did to me?" Zoe avoided the question. She talked only about her own pain, her broken engagement, the shame in front of her friends. Everything was about her. Nothing about her mother. And in that moment, it became clear Zoe hadn't come back out of love. She had come back out of convenience. Out of fear of loneliness. She listened quietly. Let her daughter speak. But deep down, she already knew the truth. Zoe didn't want to rebuild a relationship, she wanted access again. She wanted to return to being cared for, funded, shielded from real life. But that was no longer possible. The woman who once caved in at the first tear now recognized the pattern. And more importantly, she recognized her own worth. Zoe was trying to use guilt as a key. But the lock had changed. "You can come in but you can't stay," she said. Zoe's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I mean this: you don't live here anymore. If you want to talk, we can talk. But there's no longer a ready-made bed, a stocked fridge, or money in your account. I'm not your employee." Her daughter fell silent. For the first time, she saw that her mother was serious. That there was no room left for blackmail or theatrics. The door was still open, but now it came with boundaries. Zoe tried a new angle. "Mom, I'm sick, I have nowhere to go." But her mother didn't cave. Not out of coldness but out of clarity. She knew that giving in now would drag her back into the old cycle. And the only way to truly break the chain was to stay firm. She said, "I can help you with contacts. I can support you in getting back on your feet. But I will not finance more lies. I will not protect you from your responsibilities." And in that moment, she quietly said goodbye to the daughter she once knew. The conversation was short. Zoe left. No hug. No promises. Only a thick, heavy silence. But this time, the silence didn't hurt. It was a sign of self-respect, of emotional maturity, of a woman who chose herself even with a broken heart. That attempted return wasn't reconciliation. It was the final test. And she passed. Because now she knew loving herself also meant saying no even to the ones she loved most. In the days that followed, more messages came. Some sweet, others aggressive. Attempts to break her resolve. You'll regret this. You're nothing without us. But she no longer responded. She had learned that silence, when chosen consciously, could be armor. Not the weapon Zoe once used, but a shield. A barrier against what destroyed, what drained, what hurt. That softly closed door marked the end of a cycle. The closure of a dynamic built on imbalance. She didn't know if Zoe would ever return changed. She didn't need that certainty anymore. Because her peace no longer depended on it. What mattered now was that she had found her voice again. And that voice was saying, you are the priority. For the first time, the mother chose herself. And that changed everything. She woke up one morning, made her coffee the way she liked it, opened the windows, and noticed a new kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of peace. For the first time in years, there were no shouts, no demands, no desperate cries for help, no judging eyes. Just her home, sunlight streaming in, and a single thought pulsing strong, I did it. The battle hadn't been easy. But in that simplicity, she found what she had been searching for all along, a moment of true presence. She began to remember everything she had endured. The nights she was too afraid to sleep. The times she cried in silence so she wouldn't bother anyone. The weight she carried all on her own. And she realized she had spent so much time surviving that she had forgotten what it meant to truly live. The most shocking realization was that her greatest prison had never been her children, or the money, or even the house. It was the belief that she only had value if she was serving others. That belief was finally broken. She started to look at herself with different eyes. No longer as a woman worn down, used, and aged by circumstances, but as someone who, even through pain, had found the courage to change. That was strength. That was rebirth. And the most powerful part was this: her strength didn't come from some grand, heroic event. It came from the small, steady acts: her first no, her first closed account, her first night of peaceful sleep. Each choice was part of her healing. And now, she could see it had all been worth it. In the past months, she had been treated like a bank, a hospital, a taxi, an emotional crutch, everything except a person. As if her existence only mattered when it was useful. But now, with the toxic ties broken, she saw clearly that wasn't love. It was exploitation. And real love never charges your identity as the price. Real love welcomes, respects, looks you in the eyes. And she finally understood she had never been treated as a mother, but as a service. That realization was painful. It shook her roots. But it was also liberating. Because when you recognize you've been erased, you can start to redraw yourself. She rediscovered hobbies. She painted, she read, she planted. Simple things that once seemed pointless now carried deep meaning. Because they came from her, for her. With no audience, no external validation. It was self-love in action, the kind that begins the moment you decide you are enough, without needing to prove it. She started speaking about herself with pride. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. She shared her learnings with Elizabeth. Exchanged messages with other women in the online support group she had found. Neighbors and acquaintances began saying, you look different. Lighter. And she was. Because now she carried only what belonged to her. No longer the weight of others' expectations. No longer the inherited guilt. Through this process, she realized something profound: everything she had spent years searching for in others' affection, validation, respect only began to appear when she started giving it to herself. The emotional legacy she had carried, of always putting herself last, was being broken. It was hard. It hurt. But she wasn't just healing herself, she was healing an entire lineage of silenced women. And that courage was now the legacy she would leave behind. Even if no one else noticed. She knew. Because the greatest victory didn't come from apologies or external recognition. It came from the simple act of looking in the mirror and saying, I see myself. I respect myself. I choose myself. That power had never been outside of her. It had always been there, dormant, waiting for the right moment. And now that it was awake, there was no turning back. Because once you reconnect with your own essence, you can never settle for less again. She began to reshape her home. Not with grand renovations, but with small changes that carried meaning. She painted the living room wall blue, the color she had always wanted but never dared to choose. She bought new pillows, replaced the curtains, donated old furniture. Each change was symbolic. A declaration that the space, once heavy with noise and painful memories, was now her sanctuary. A house that had once been full of people but empty of love was now a home. Her home. Her routine changed completely. She woke early, walked in the park, drank coffee slowly. She read a passage from a book every day. She cared for her plants, her nails, her skin, not out of vanity, but out of joy. For the first time in years, she lived in the present. No yelling, no demands, no fabricated emergencies. Just time flowing gently. And in that comforting silence of her own company, she discovered what peace really felt like. Her friendships changed too. Where once she only had transactional relationships, she now cultivated genuine connections. Elizabeth remained by her side, and new people appeared, those with similar stories, similar wounds, a hunger to begin again. She joined local gatherings, cultural fairs, online writing courses. She discovered she had a gift for words. She wrote memories, short stories, reflections. Not to publish but to heal. She began attracting what once seemed impossible, relationships based on mutual respect. No demands, no blackmail. Just honest exchange. And in this new world, she learned she could trust again. That not everyone wanted something in return. That genuine affection still existed. And, most importantly, that she could protect herself without isolating herself. That she could say yes without losing herself, and no without guilt. She started planning a trip. Small, modest, but deeply symbolic. She chose a place she had always dreamed of visiting but had never had time or priority for. Now, she was the priority. She spent weeks researching itineraries, cafes, little hidden corners. It was the first trip made by her, for her, with her. And that meant everything. Because it wasn't just about the destination. It was a marker. The beginning of a life where she chose the path literally and emotionally. She also redefined her family ties. She didn't cut everyone off, but she redrew each connection. With clear rules, firm limits, and openness only to those who showed a genuine desire to change. Her middle son began to approach her with respect. Slowly, a new dialogue was born. No guarantees but honesty. And that was enough. She no longer demanded perfection. Only truth. Only to be seen as who she was, not just what she gave. She began to dream again. About projects, new friendships, books she still wanted to read. Stories she still wanted to write. Versions of herself that had been tucked away for decades. And that feeling of freedom was almost intoxicating. A kind of energy that came from within, fueled by the certainty that she no longer had to adapt to the world, she could shape her own. And more than that, she could be happy inside it. This new life wasn't made of grand victories. It was built on small, consistent choices. Quiet days. Respectful decisions. Genuine smiles. It was the life she had always deserved, but had never known she could have. And now that she did, she would never give it up. Because when a woman rediscovers her freedom, no emotional prison can hold her again. And she was, finally, free, not just from her past, but from everything that had once kept her from being whole. She sat on her porch one evening, a book on her lap, a cup of tea in her hand. The sky was fading into night, and for the first time in years, she felt no rush for anything. There was no endless to-do list. No phone buzzing with demands, manipulations, or veiled blackmail. Just her peace, and a thought pulsing in her chest: I respect myself. Simple words, but once unimaginable. And now, the foundation of her new life. That self-respect hadn't come from compliments or forgiveness received. It came from her choice to stop abandoning herself. From the moment she understood she deserved the same care she had given everyone else for so long. Every no she said, every boundary she set, every silence she held, each one was a brick in this new foundation. And the most surprising part? She felt no guilt. She felt pride. Because she had discovered that caring for herself was not selfishness. It was survival. Now she could see everything she had endured with clarity. Everything she had swallowed to maintain the facade of the perfect mother. And looking back, she no longer saw failure. She saw strength. Because few could have survived what she did and still chosen healing. The journey wasn't beautiful all the time. There was pain, yes. But it was that pain that created space for awareness. And awareness, in turn, brought freedom. She understood now true love never demands the sacrifice of your identity. Never requires unconditional presence without reciprocity. Never twists affection into control. That clarity changed everything. She began choosing her relationships more carefully, her projects, even the thoughts she entertained. She learned to protect herself without shutting down. To love herself without apologizing. And that was the greatest rebirth of all, being whole, without fear of being too much. Sometimes, her daughter sent short texts. Not hostile but shallow. She read them calmly. Replied if she wanted. Ignored them if she didn't. Not out of revenge but because she now knew her time was valuable. Her peace non-negotiable. And that the presence of other seven, her children, only mattered if it came with respect. She had broken the cycle. The chain that kept mothers tied to roles, not relationships. This new version of herself was stronger, calmer, freer. She knew what she wanted. And what she would never accept again. She knew the past still hurt, but it no longer dictated her steps. Now, she walked with intention. And with every step, she left behind not people, but patterns. Weights. Roles. Everything that once crushed her more than life itself. She no longer sought external approval. No longer craved to be understood by everyone. Because she finally understood that some people would never recognize her worth, and that was okay. The important thing was that she recognized it. And that was enough. The respect she had sought all her life now came from within. It was a gentle look in the mirror. A quiet voice whispering, I am here for you. I always have been. And I'll never abandon you again. That is the true victory. Not conquering others, but rescuing yourself. Building a life where you don't need permission to exist. A life where silence is a choice, not a punishment. Where solitude is company, not abandonment. And where love begins in the only place it ever should, within. Because when a woman chooses herself, the world around her changes. And she, finally, became her own world at peace. Maybe you saw yourself in this story. Maybe you, too, have learned to swallow your pain just to keep a false sense of peace. The good news? It's never too late to choose yourself. To break cycles. To build a new life filled with freedom, respect, and self-love. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There are so many people still living in silence, and sometimes, the right word at the right moment can change everything. Remember, living is not about sacrificing yourself to the end. It's about respecting yourself from the beginning. You are not alone. And your turning point can start right now.